In June 2017, Travis Kalanick resigned as CEO of Uber, the company he had built from nothing into the most valuable private technology startup in the world. The resignation was not voluntary in any meaningful sense. His major investors, led by Benchmark Capital, had delivered a letter from 5 venture capital firms demanding his departure. The man who had built an $80 billion company, who had fought regulators on 5 continents, resigned because the people who held the capital could no longer support his continued leadership. Uber's story is, beneath its surface details, a story about what organizations become when growth is treated as a value that supersedes all other values, about the specific and predictable ways a culture built around winning at all costs corrupts itself, and whether that culture can be genuinely reformed or merely cosmetically managed. Kalanick co-founded Uber in 2009, and from the beginning, the company's culture was an expression of his personality in ways that were both its greatest strength and the source of its eventual crisis. He was a person of extraordinary energy, intelligence, and competitive drive. His previous companies had produced in him a specific theory of winning: move faster than the competition, be more aggressive than the incumbents, be comfortable operating in the gray areas between what's clearly legal and clearly prohibited. Build a team of warriors who would do whatever was necessary. These convictions were not irrational in their original context. The taxi industry Uber was disrupting was a protected cartel. Entrenched local monopolies maintained not by superior service, but by regulatory barriers that prevented competition. Building Uber required launching in cities where ride-sharing's legal status was unclear, fighting regulatory battles while building market presence, moving faster than regulators could respond. In its early form, applied to the genuine inadequacies of the taxi cartel, this approach had legitimate elements. The problem was that it didn't stay in its original context. The tactics, arguably defensible for disrupting a corrupt regulatory system, became the default approach to every situation, including many where the rules being broken were not incumbent protections, but genuine safeguards of people's safety, privacy, and dignity. The culture Kalanick built was formalized in a set of internal values that were specific, idiosyncratic, and revealing: toe-stepping, fierceness, super-pumpedness, principled confrontation, always be hustlin', champion's mindset. Read together, these constitute an explicit culture of aggressive, competitive, rules-challenging behavior. They valorize confrontation over diplomacy, winning over process, individual ambition over collective norms. They did not explicitly say, disrespect women, ignore legal requirements, deceive regulators. But they created an environment in which these behaviors became predictable outcomes. When winning is the supreme value, the people who win at the expense of their colleagues' dignity win. When confrontation is valorized, the most aggressive and hostile people are valorized with it. When rule bending is celebrated, the people most willing to bend rules, including the rules that protect people from harm, are celebrated. The cultural values were not a description of what the company did, they were a description of what it rewarded. And what they rewarded produced, with complete predictability, the culture that Susan Fowler described in February 2017. Fowler was a software engineer who joined Uber in November 2015 and left approximately a year later. Her blog post describing her experience was precise, detailed, and measured. It read not as an emotional complaint, but as a careful account of specific incidents and the organizational responses that had failed to address them. She described an organization where women who raised complaints were told that the men involved were too important to discipline, where performance reviews were manipulated to deny justified promotions, where the stated values of diversity bore no relationship to the actual management decisions being made. The post went viral immediately. It produced an investigation led by former Attorney General Eric Holder that took 4 months and produced more than 200 recommendations for cultural and organizational reform. The board adopted all of them. Implementing them would be the work of the leadership transition the investigation catalyzed. The Greyball program is the most revealing single illustration of Uber's culture at its worst because it shows how the normalization of regulatory evasion could produce, through a series of individually rationalized decisions, a program of deliberate deception that was technically sophisticated and ethically indefensible. Greyball was software that identified regulatory enforcement officials attempting to use the Uber app to gather evidence of Uber operating in prohibited cities. When these characteristics were detected, credit cards linked to government entities, ride patterns consistent with surveillance, the software showed the official a ghosted version of the app displaying no available drivers, effectively hiding the company's operations from the people trying to observe them. Uber used Greyball in cities across the United States and internationally. It was not a rogue program. It was developed by a team, authorized by lawyers, used systematically across multiple markets, and known to senior leadership. The legal dispute with Google over autonomous vehicle technology demonstrated how the culture of winning at all costs operated in a specific competitive context. Anthony Lewandowski, a prominent engineer at Google's self-driving car project, downloaded approximately 14,000 confidential files from Google's servers before leaving to found a startup called Otto, which Uber acquired for approximately $680 million. Waymo sued Uber for trade secret theft. The case settled for approximately $245 million in equity. Lewandowski pleaded guilty to trade secret theft and was sentenced to 18 months in prison. The board's choice to replace Kalanick was Dara Khosrowshahi, who had been CEO of Expedia for over a decade. He was, in almost every dimension, the opposite of Kalanick. Measured where Kalanick was volatile, diplomatic where Kalanick was confrontational, cautious where Kalanick was aggressive. The appointment was itself a statement about what the company needed. Khosrowshahi's cultural reset began with a new set of values that replaced Kalanick's aggressive formulations with something more conventional. Doing the right thing, celebrating differences, acting like owners. Less idiosyncratic, less revealing, and notably less likely to produce the specific behaviors the old values had produced. The more substantive expressions of the reset were less visible but more consequential. He apologized to London's transport regulator after Uber's license was revoked. He reformed the human resources function. He changed the reporting relationships that had allowed the harassment culture to persist without accountability. He made significant senior leadership changes. He also changed the company's relationship with regulators more broadly, replacing the Kalanick-era launch-first, fight-later approach with genuine engagement, accepting constraints that the old culture would have refused, and treating regulatory relationships as things worth maintaining rather than obstacles to overcome. The question of Uber's drivers connects the company's story most directly to the broader social consequences of the gig economy it pioneered. Uber classified its drivers as independent contractors, a classification that exempted the company from employment benefits, minimum wage guarantees, workers' compensation, and anti-discrimination protections. The classification was financially essential to the business model. It was also, from the perspective of labor law experts and many drivers themselves, incorrect. Drivers who drove primarily for Uber, on Uber's terms, at Uber's prices, subject to deactivation without cause, look much more like employees than contractors. The legal battle over this classification was fought in dozens of jurisdictions simultaneously. California became the central battlefield. Uber, Lyft, and other platforms funded Proposition 22, a ballot initiative to explicitly classify gig workers as independent contractors, with approximately $200 million in 2020. It passed. It was subsequently challenged in court. This was where the gap between the new values and the business model's imperatives was most visible. A company articulating that it did the right thing and valued its driver partners, while spending $200 million to prevent those partners from receiving employment protections, was demonstrating a tension between stated values and operational choices that genuine cultural reform would eventually have to confront. Khosrowshahi made genuine improvements. Earnings guarantees in some markets, improved deactivation processes, some benefit extensions. The structural classification question remained unresolved. Uber went public in May 2019 at $45 per share and a valuation of approximately $82 billion. The IPO disappointed. The stock fell on its first day and continued trading below the offering price for months. The public markets assessment reflected concerns about the path to profitability and whether the cultural reforms had addressed the company's fundamental issues or merely managed their reputational consequences. The listing also imposed governance requirements the private company had resisted for years: board composition, financial reporting, executive compensation disclosures, related party transaction requirements, all now public. The governance improvements Khosrowshahi had made were real, and the disclosures reflected a company substantially more transparent and accountable than it had been under Kalanick. The COVID-19 pandemic tested the reformed culture in ways no governance document could fully prepare for. Demand for shared transportation collapsed overnight. Uber laid off approximately 3,700 employees in May 2020. Khosrowshahi's management of the layoffs was, by most accounts, more humane than comparable situations at comparable companies. Genuine communication, generous severance, public acknowledgement of contributions. The behavioral difference from what the Kalanick era would have produced was visible and real. The question of whether Uber's cultural reset was genuine or performative cannot be answered by the company's own communications. The markers of genuine change are behavioral, visible in specific decisions made under conditions of real competitive pressure, legal risk, and financial cost. Some markers were positive. The regulatory relationships Khosrowshahi rebuilt required real behavioral changes, not merely changed tone. The safety report, which disclosed approximately 6,000 reported sexual assaults during rides in 2017 and 2018, was a genuine act of transparency that stood in sharp contrast to the Kalanick era's approach to reputational risk. The management changes that removed people associated with the worst behaviors were real personnel decisions with real costs. Other markers were more ambiguous. The continued spending of hundreds of millions of dollars to prevent drivers from being classified as employees after the stated cultural reset was a specific behavioral choice that sat in tension with the reformed values. The ongoing litigation over driver classification deployed aggressive legal strategies more reminiscent of the Kalanick era than the reformed culture. This ambiguity is not unique to Uber. It is the typical condition of organizations attempting genuine cultural transformation. Some behaviors changed, some have not. The changes are real but incomplete. The gap between stated values and specific operational decisions is narrower than it was, but not closed. The assessment of Kalanick's legacy requires the same honesty required throughout these stories. The recognition that genuinely damaging conduct and genuine achievement can coexist in the same person and organization. Kalanick built something real. Uber transformed urban transportation in ways that were genuinely beneficial for hundreds of millions of people. The disruption of taxi cartels that had overcharged consumers and underserved markets was a genuine improvement. The technology platform he built, the engineering capabilities he assembled, the market position he established through years of aggressive and sometimes brilliant competitive maneuvering, these are real achievements. The crises of 2017 are also real achievements in the specific sense that they are real outcomes of deliberate choices. They are not side effects or accidents unrelated to the culture Kalanick built. They are its direct and predictable products. The harassment culture, Greyball, the Waymo theft, the driver exploitation, all were the outcome of a set of values that explicitly subordinated ethical constraint to competitive success. The first mover mythology, the belief that in platform markets, the first company to achieve scale would capture the market permanently, created conditions in which the competitive cost of ethical constraint appeared unacceptably high. This mythology was validated by enough examples that it became a template for investment strategy and competitive behavior. It was also selectively applied and sometimes wrong. Uber's aggressive strategy didn't prevent Lyft from building significant market position, didn't prevent Didi from dominating China, didn't prevent Grab from dominating Southeast Asia. The first mover defense was real but not absolute, and the cost of building it through systematic ethical failure was paid by real people whose interests the mythology treated as irrelevant to the competitive calculus. Kalanick built Uber to win. Winning was the value from which all other values derived, and the culture he built expressed that priority with unusual clarity and consistency. The result was a company extraordinarily effective at winning, and a company that treated the people who made it possible as instruments of competitive success rather than as people with interests the company had obligations to respect. The cultural reset was an attempt to build a different mechanism, to create language for a distinction the old culture had no words for, to structure incentives that encoded a different set of priorities, to find leadership that embodied something other than winning at all costs. The attempt was serious, costly, and partially successful. It produced a company genuinely better than the one Kalanick left,